I've seen all kinds of interruptions in the brownstone. Clients knocking at 8 in the morning, cops dropping in without a smile, salesmen who didn't know they'd already lost before they'd started talking. But the one that landed on us that Tuesday afternoon wasn't human. It was a paper bag. To be fair, it was no ordinary bag. Brown, thick, folded neatly at the top with a strip of white string like the bakeries in Little Italy use. It wasn't mine, and it sure wasn't Wolfe's. He doesn't go out, and I don't come home carrying carbohydrate contraband when Fritz is in the kitchen preparing something civilized. But there it was, perched smack in the middle of Wolfe's red leather chair in the office, like it owned the place. Now, Nero Wolfe has 2 rules that could probably be carved into the cornerstone of the house. 1, he doesn't leave it. 2, nothing leaves its place without his say-so. Finding a stranger's bakery bag in his chair was as close to discovering a horse in the bathtub as far as the order of things went. I stood in the doorway, holding my hat, and called upstairs. "Wolfe!" There was a grunt from above. That meant he was still tending to his orchids, and it also meant he had no plans of moving until the clock hit 6 and dinner bells rang. So I went over to the bag. No label, no grease stains, no smell of butter cookies sneaking out. Whoever dropped it off had wrapped it so clean it looked like a package from a haberdasher. I untied the string and folded the top down. Inside wasn't food. It was a neat stack of envelopes, cream-colored, no stamps, all sealed. I didn't touch them long. I just counted, 8 in total, and read the name written on the top one. Not Wolfe's, not mine, not Fritz's. Just a single word in heavy black ink. Remind. I put the bag down and went to wash my hands. You never know when Wolfe will demand to know whether your paws have been in something unsanitary. When Wolfe came down at 6, I was waiting. He entered the office, grumbled about the temperature being half a degree too warm, and finally looked at the chair, his lips pressed together so tight you could have snapped a cigar on them. "What's that?" he asked, pointing with his eyes instead of his finger. "Unless Fritz decided to moonlight at a bakery, I'd say it's a gift from a stranger," I told him. "Wrapped in a bag, addressed to no one, containing something that doesn't smell like strudel. You want to look?" He made the sound that usually means he doesn't, but he sat at his desk instead of his chair and motioned for me to bring it. I placed it in front of him, opened, with the envelopes lined like soldiers. He didn't touch them. He just looked, his eyes hooded, heavy. Then, with a kind of ceremonial distaste, he took out one envelope and slit it open with his gold knife. He read in silence. After a minute, he dropped it on the desk and said, "Phooey." "Good or bad?" I asked. "Neither." Trite, I picked it up. The page inside carried 3 sentences, typed with no signature. "What has been hidden must be restored. A promise unkept festers. This is the first." I whistled low. "Looks like we've been drafted into someone's poetry club. Why the delivery here? Why not the library bulletin board?" Wolfe ignored me, leaned back and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for a while, and I knew better than to keep poking. But when he finally spoke, it was the kind of slow murmur that means he's already decided something. "We shall not return it to the street. We will wait." "Wait for what?" "The next trespass." He opened his eyes, dark as a cellar, and added, "Archie, someone has introduced a disorder into this house that I will not abide." That was the hook. If you want Wolfe interested, just mess with his routine. And if you want me interested, leave 8 envelopes in a bakery bag without a name. The first thing you need to know about Nero Wolfe is that he doesn't believe in accidents. If a leaf blows in through the front door, he'll call it a trespass of air currents. If Fritz drops a spoon in the kitchen, he'll pronounce it sabotage of dinner. So when an unmarked bakery bag with cryptic notes materialized in his chair, it was no mystery that Wolfe classified it as a deliberate assault. And if you've ever watched Wolfe when his sense of order is toyed with, you'll know why I didn't bother suggesting we toss the bag out, burn it, or deliver it to Inspector Kramer with a bow on top. Wolfe's fat fingers had already smoothed one of the envelopes like a cat pawing at a captured mouse. He was in. By Wednesday morning, the brownstone had already stopped being the quiet fortress it was supposed to be. At 10 sharp, the doorbell rang. Not the usual polite buzz. A long, impatient one, like the caller had a finger cramp. I opened up. Standing there was a woman in her mid-30s, tall, dark hair tucked back in a way that screamed, "No time for nonsense," carrying a leather satchel. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. "You're Goodwin," she said. "That's a popular theory," I replied. "And you are?" "Clara Bellotti. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately." She brushed past like the hallway belonged to her. I could have stopped her, but I've learned that sometimes letting a storm walk into the office is the fastest way to watch Wolfe handle it. When I announced her, Wolfe was in his chair, glaring at the envelopes he'd stacked into a neat column. He looked up, and his brows moved in a way that meant he wasn't charmed by the intrusion. "Madam," he said, voice flat as cement, "you have entered my house without leave. State your business in 10 words. Clara sat down without asking. "The envelopes. They're mine. They should never have reached you." That got my attention. I leaned against the globe stand and let Wolfe do the heavy lifting. "Explain," he commanded. "They're part of a personal arrangement, private communications. I had them delivered to a friend. Somehow they ended up here. I'll take them and be gone." She reached for the stack. Wolfe shifted in his chair but didn't move his bulk. Just his eyes. "No," he said. "They were placed here deliberately. You will not remove them until I understand why." Clara's lips thinned. "You don't understand. These involve promises, debts, things that—" "Pfui," Wolfe cut her off. "Madam, you're attempting to retrieve something from my office with neither candor nor courtesy. Archie, do not allow it." She turned on me, sharp as a dagger. "You can't keep what isn't yours." "Lady," I said, "if you've got a complaint, file it in triplicate with the local police. Until then, you're playing in Wolfe's sandbox. And trust me, he doesn't share." Clara's nostrils flared, but instead of bolting, she slumped back in the chair, clutching her satchel like it was a shield. That was round 1. Round 2 came in the form of the doorbell again, this time at noon. I answered and found a man who could have been carved from mahogany and sourness. Heavy shoulders, thick hands, an overcoat too warm for the weather. He carried no bag, but his eyes roved the foyer as if measuring how much trouble it would take to rob us. "Name's Vincent Caro," he said. "You got something of mine." I sighed. "I'm starting to think the brownstone's been listed in the classifieds under lost and found." "Care to specify what?" "A package," he said. "Dropped by mistake. Hand it over." "Funny coincidence," I told him. "A lady just gave me the same routine. Difference is, she came with a satchel. You came with an attitude. Which one should I believe?" He shoved his way past me. By then, Wolfe had heard the commotion and was glaring from his chair like Jupiter with indigestion. Caro planted himself in front of Wolfe's desk. "Listen, mister. That bag—" "Sit," Wolfe ordered. Caro hesitated. Men like him don't like taking orders from men like Wolfe. Immovable, unsmiling, unbothered. But the force of Wolfe's voice is hard to resist, like gravity. Caro sat. "You are," Wolfe said, "the second claimant of these intrusions. Who are you in relation to the woman?" "I don't know what woman you're talking about." "Pfui. You lie badly." Wolfe's eyes closed halfway. "You will tell the truth, or Archie will escort you to Inspector Kramer, who has no tolerance for your type." Caro's jaw clenched. He leaned forward. I work for the Bellottis. They have family business. These envelopes—" "Enough," Wolfe snapped. "Not another syllable until you can articulate with precision. You have disturbed my house. You will leave." Caro looked like he wanted to argue, but Wolfe's tone had the finality of a steel door slamming shut. He stood, shot me a glare that promised trouble, and stormed out. I shut the door behind him, locked it, and went back to the office. Clara was still there, watching Wolfe like a student caught cheating on an exam. "You see what you've invited?" Wolfe rumbled. "Archie, note the hour. Trespass begets trespass. Soon there will be a third." He was right. By 5 o'clock, before Fritz could announce dinner, the bell rang again. This time it was Saul Panzer, my favorite relief pitcher. If Saul shows up without being called, something's brewing. "Archie," Saul said, eyes steady as a sniper's. "You got company circling the block? Same car, 3 passes. They're watching the brownstone." I whistled. "Word spreads fast. Wolfe, we've gone from a bakery bag to a parade." Wolfe grunted. His bulk shifted in the chair. He spoke slowly, savoring each word as though it were a morsel Fritz had plated. "Archie, these intrusions escalate. Someone has maneuvered us into their quarrel." "Very well. We shall not be maneuvered. We shall take possession." I asked. "Possession of what?" He pointed one fat finger at the envelopes. "Of the truth. Bring Clara back tomorrow at 11, and find out what connects her to Mr. Caro before then. Saul, continue watching. No one else enters without my consent." Saul nodded and slipped out like a ghost. Clara looked like she was trying to decide whether to faint or bolt. Wolfe rang for beer, drank half the glass in silence, and then gave me the order I knew was coming. "Archie, legs and eyes. Tonight." Which meant he wanted me to tail Clara, dig into the Bellottis, and come back with something more substantial than bakery bags and cryptic notes. I glanced at the envelopes, still sitting there like they'd sprouted roots on his desk. "You sure you want to keep those?" I asked. Wolfe's eyes closed. "They have trespassed. Until I know their nature, they are my prisoners." That was Wolfe for you. A man can barge into his house and he'll tolerate it with insults. A bag lands in his chair and suddenly it's war. And war, when Nero Wolfe declares it, has a way of shaking the brownstone down to its bricks. If you ask me, the best part about detective work is the parade. Not the Macy's kind. The kind where people line up and show you just how guilty they look without realizing it. Wolfe calls it delineating the circle of suspects. I call it watching the human comedy roll through the brownstone like it was audition day. By Thursday morning, the stage was set. Wolfe had commanded Clara Bellotti to return at 11. I made a couple of phone calls in the meantime, some with Saul Panzer, some with Lon Cohen at the Gazette, to see just who the Bellotti clan were and why they seemed to have a homing pigeon connection to our front door. Turns out the Bellottis weren't just any family. They were half restaurant royalty, half deli dynasty. Old man Pietro Bellotti had built an empire on bread and sauce in the 40s, one trattoria at a time. By the 60s, he'd planted enough cousins and nephews in the food business to make half of Little Italy his dining room. But Pietro was gone now, leaving 3 heirs, 2 feuds, and 1 trust fund that looked like a hungry wolf pack was circling it. So, when Clara walked back into the office, satchel again in hand, she wasn't just some lady chasing envelopes. She was a Bellotti, daughter of Pietro's younger brother, with a reputation for consulting on family finances. Wolfe wasted no time. "Madame, you have half an hour. Who else lays claim to these papers, and why?" She hesitated, then admitted, "They concern a promise my uncle made. He owed obligations. Each envelope was to be delivered at a certain time, to a certain person, quietly. Now someone's interfering." "Who are the recipients?" Wolfe asked. She rattled off 4 names, and just like that, we had our circle. 1. Vincent Caro, already barged in once. Officially, he was a business associate, which is what you call a guy who gets his hands dirty so others don't. Clara said he handled deliveries, collections, the kind of jobs that required broad shoulders and limited imagination. If the envelopes were meant for others, Caro probably didn't like losing track of them. Second Dr. Emile Riva, a family lawyer, a thin, nervous man with a record of settling disputes out of court, usually by keeping everything in the family and off the books. Clara didn't trust him, but Pietro had, which meant his fingerprints were all over the so-called obligations. 3. Gina Ferraro, Pietro's goddaughter, a soprano with the Met. Famous voice, famous temper. She'd been promised support for her career, and rumor was Pietro had funded her rise with more than applause. Whether the envelopes had music or money, Gina was expecting her share. 4. Marco Bellotti, Clara's cousin, ran the original Bellotti Trattoria, the one still drawing tourists. Clara called him ambitious. Translation: he wanted the whole pie and didn't mind cutting the family recipe down to scraps if it gave him more. Those were the fourth. Add Clara herself, and you had a recipe for indigestion. Wolfe sat, heavy as a throne, while I took notes. He chewed on the information like it was underdone beef. "Archie," he said, "you will fetch them. Each. Here. At staggered times. I will speak with them in my house. Now, getting one Bellotti to talk is easy. Getting 4 without blood spilled on the doorstep is harder. But by noon, I'd already started the parade. First up, Dr. Emile Riva. He came at 1 o'clock, a slim figure in a grey suit that looked like it had been pressed until the threads squealed. His hands fidgeted with his briefcase. He didn't want to sit, but Wolfe motioned and gravity did the rest. "These envelopes," Wolfe began. "Do you know their content?" Riva adjusted his glasses. "Confidential. My late client entrusted them as delayed communications." "To whom?" "That depends. To the proper recipients, of course. My duty is to safeguard them." Wolfe rumbled. "Phooey, you failed. They are here, not safeguarded." Riva squirmed like a worm in sunlight. "If they are here, then you must understand. They were misdirected. No harm intended." I asked him flat out if he had keys to Pietro's old files. He stammered yes, then no. Then, in a manner of speaking. Which told me he'd been dipping into things he shouldn't. When Wolfe dismissed him, he left like the chair had left a stain. Next, Gina Ferraro. She arrived like a brass band, perfume first, fur coat next, voice last, pitched to carry across the East River. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, tossing herself onto the sofa, "I hear you have what belongs to me. About time someone respectable handled it." Wolfe didn't blink. "Your entitlement is premature. I do not know what belongs to you." "It's money," she said bluntly. "Pietro promised. He said when the time came I'd be cared for. That time is now." "Indeed. And you assume these are drafts on his fortune?" "What else would they be? Love letters?" Her laugh filled the office like champagne sprayed too soon. But under the sparkle, her eyes were sharp, desperate. She wanted those envelopes not as a diva, but as a woman afraid the curtain was about to fall. Wolfe let her bluster, then rang the bell for Fritz. While she accepted coffee, Wolfe said nothing more, letting silence weigh heavier than argument. By the time she left, her voice had dropped a full octave. Third, Marco Bellotti. Marco was thick where Gina was loud, solid where Riva was twitchy. He filled the chair with the confidence of a man who owns half the block. "Those papers," he said, jabbing a finger at Wolfe's desk, "are family property. They don't belong in your hands." "On the contrary," Wolfe replied, "they were placed here, in mine." "Why?" Marco smirked. Because someone wants to stir the pot. My guess? Clara. She's always thought she could manage what she can't. Don't be her pawn. I asked what his interest was. Stability, he said. The business, the name. You think tourists come for spaghetti. They come for a dynasty. I intend to keep it. Those envelopes threaten it. He stood without being dismissed, which earned him a glacial glare from Wolfe, but he left his scent of cigar smoke behind like a challenge. Finally, Vincent Caro. He returned in the evening, this time under my escort. Wolfe had insisted. Caro wasn't happy about it, but he parked himself in the chair like a sulking bulldog. You again, Wolfe said. Yeah, Caro muttered, and I'll keep coming until you give back what's mine. What is yours? My job. I was supposed to deliver those. Somebody cut me out. Who? Wolfe asked. Caro's jaw worked, but no words came, which told me he knew exactly who, but naming them was like biting his own tongue. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half shut. Mr. Caro, you are blunt, unsubtle, and dangerous. Yet you are not a liar. You will return tomorrow at 4. That ended the parade. By the time I closed the door on Caro, the brownstone felt smaller than it had in years. The envelopes were still stacked, untouched, prisoners of Wolfe's logic. Each claimant had circled them like wolves around meat, but none had dared strike. Not yet. I sat down and asked Wolfe, "Satisfied?" He opened his eyes, fixed them on me, and said, "No. This circle is incomplete. One more hand has moved these pieces. Find it." That was Wolfe. He didn't just see who was in the room. He saw the shadow of the one who hadn't shown up, and I had the feeling that before long, that shadow was going to knock. The thing about Nero Wolfe is, he can map out the battlefield without leaving his chair, but somebody has to walk the trenches. That somebody is yours, truly. By Friday morning, he had already set me marching orders. Sniff out inconsistencies in our 4 performers' stories and bring back something that smelled stronger than their perfume, cigars, or sweat. I started with Dr. Emile Riva. Lawyers are slippery, and I like to catch them before they remember how to wriggle. His office was in a second-rate building near Madison, brass plaque on the door trying to look more expensive than it was. His secretary had eyes sharp enough to cut string, but I used the smile that usually gets me past hotel clerks. Inside, Riva was hunched over papers like a vulture over bones. He jumped when he saw me. That told me plenty. "Mr. Goodwin, wasn't it? Look, I already said to Mr. Wolfe, this is a family matter." "Yeah," I cut in, "and families are great at fighting over scraps. What I need to know is why you, who were supposed to safeguard Pietro Bellotti's intentions, let them wander into a bakery bag." He stammered something about couriers, clerks, and accidents. I pressed harder, asked who else had keys to his filing cabinets. He named no one, which was as good as confessing everyone. I took a look around while he sweated. One cabinet had a fresh scrape near the lock, not 2 days old. Either Riva was clumsy with his briefcase or someone had helped themselves. I left him wiping his forehead and called Lon Cohen from a payphone. Lon confirmed rumors. Riva had been accused once of losing documents in another estate squabble, but nothing stuck. A reputation for convenient incompetence. File that under suspect with greasy hands. Next stop, Gina Ferraro. Tracking down a soprano between rehearsals takes finesse, but her name opened doors. I found her backstage at Lincoln Center, dressed in silk and steam, warming up her voice for Puccini. She spotted me and waved like we were old friends. "Archie, I thought you'd come to escort me to my destiny." "Sorry, lady. I left my golden chariot in the shop," I said. "I'm just here to ask why you're so sure those envelopes have your name on them." She pouted, then launched into an aria of her own. How Pietro had adored her. How he promised she'd never worry about critics or creditors. How she was entitled to more than applause. While she was hitting her high notes, I noticed something odd. Her dressing table had an envelope. Cream, sealed, identical to the ones on Wolfe's desk. Only this one had her name in Pietro's hand. "Nice stationery," I said casually. "Keepsakes?" She froze. Too fast, then laughed, too loud. "Just a souvenir, darling. Nothing important." I wasn't born yesterday. That envelope was a twin, which meant Gina already had one, and her act about waiting for Pietro's support was pure curtain dressing. By 3 o'clock, I had an appointment with Marco Bellotti. He insisted on meeting at his trattoria, of course. The place was packed with tourists chewing pasta and thinking they were tasting old-world authenticity. Marco sat in the back booth, cigar smoldering like a threat. "You again," he said. "Yeah," I told him. "Me again. Thought I'd ask why you're worried about envelopes that, according to you, threaten stability. If they're just promises, why not let them play out?" "Because," he growled, "promises make people greedy. My aunt thinks she's owed money. My cousin thinks he's owed land. Gina thinks she's owed fame. You let those letters loose, you'll have half the family clawing each other. I keep the lid on, the pot doesn't boil over." "Interesting theory," I said. "But funny thing, Gina already has one of those letters. You know that?" Marco's jaw stopped moving. He covered it quick with a laugh, but the sweat beading under his collar wasn't passed to steam. He knew exactly what I was talking about. When I left, I caught one of his waiters watching me too closely. Not the look of a man curious about my tip, the look of a man under orders. I didn't stay for dessert. The day wouldn't be complete without Caro, so I strolled by his usual haunt, a pool hall down on Mulberry where loyalty is measured in cues and debts. Caro was there, leaning on a table, barking at a younger man who was losing money faster than he could sink balls. When he saw me, he straightened. "You following me, Goodwin?" "Only when I'm bored," I said, "which means today. Tell me, Caro, why do you care so much about letters you don't even understand?" His brow furrowed. "I understand plenty. Pietro trusted me. He gave me jobs. I did 'em clean. These letters, they're part of that trust. Someone trying to cut me out." "Who?" He chewed on the question like it was tough meat, then spat. "Riva. That pencil neck. He thinks he can run things. He can't." So Caro had a theory, and it was painted in Riva's colors, but I noticed something else. Caro's hands were rough, sure, but his nails had ink stains. The kind you don't get from pool chalk. Maybe he'd handled more paper than he wanted to admit. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the evening had settled heavy. I gave Wolfe the rundown while he polished off lamb with mint. Riva's office shows signs of burglary. Maybe inside job. Gina already has one envelope, which means she's faking her ignorance. Marco sweats when he hears that, which tells me he knows too. Caro points fingers at Riva but has ink-stained hands himself. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed. So, each of them is entangled. None of them is candid. "Congratulations," I said. "You've got a collection of liars. How's that different from your orchid society?" He ignored me. "Archie, the envelopes. Bring one, not the first. The third I fetched it." He slit it with his knife, drew out the paper. The type was the same as before, cold and mechanical. "The third debt remains unpaid. It festers. It must be faced." No names, no dates, just another riddle. Wolfe's lips tightened. Deliberate obfuscation. Whoever orchestrated this intends not revelation, but torment. I asked him flat out, "So what's the play? We keep letting them visit, or do we make a move?" He drank beer, thought, then rumbled. "The play is theirs. But soon they will err. Until then, Archie, we wait." "Wait for what?" "The next trespass. He closed his eyes, which meant the discussion was over. I went to my desk, but not before wondering. When Wolfe waits, it's like a cat waiting for a bird. Still, quiet, inevitable. And outside the brownstone, I had a hunch the birds were already circling. If you've never seen Nero Wolfe frown at a bottle of saffron, then you've missed one of life's rarest performances. Wolfe doesn't make a habit of registering disturbances. He usually reserves his face for scowls of disdain or glowers at my jokes. But on that Wednesday morning, at precisely 10:12 a.m., he froze while arranging a bundle of herbs on his desk. Now, Wolfe has his routines. Everyone in the brownstone knows them. Fritz, Theodore, even Saul, who isn't in the house most of the time, but still manages to live by Wolfe's clock when he's here. From 9 to 11 every morning, Wolfe tends to his orchids in the plant rooms upstairs. At 11, he comes down, sits at his desk, and makes some ceremonial gesture involving food, books, or correspondence. On that day, the ceremonial gesture was the placing of a neat row of spice jars on his blotter. He had been muttering about an experiment Fritz was trying, some manner of venison stew that needed adjustment. Wolfe reached for the saffron jar. His fingers stopped mid-air. "Archie," he said. "I was at my typewriter, transcribing notes from my last trek through the maze of Manhattan bakeries." "Yes, sir?" "Someone has been here." Now, I'm used to Wolfe's pronouncements. Half the time, they're more startling than a slap on the back in a dark alley, but I've learned not to jump. "In this room?" I asked, swiveling in my chair. "In this house," Wolfe replied. "In this office, certainly." His thumb touched the jar delicately, like it was a loaded pistol. "Observe." I got up, leaned over, and looked. The saffron jar was turned half an inch clockwise. Now, I don't catalogue spice jars for a living, but Wolfe might as well have been pointing at a set of footprints in wet cement. "You're telling me," I said, "that somebody broke in to rearrange your seasonings." He gave me one of his mild, slow blinks. "You, Archie, have the unfortunate tendency to belittle what you do not comprehend. This jar was not left thus. My habits are orderly. It has been moved." "By who?" "Fritz. Number Fritz has not entered this office since last night when he brought me beer." "Me?" He gave me a snort. "You have less regard for saffron than for philosophy." I leaned back. "So we've got a phantom jar turner. What does it mean? A warning? A love note? Maybe we've got a poltergeist with expensive taste." Wolfe ignored me, staring at the saffron like it had insulted his ancestry. After a long pause, he said, "Something has been disturbed. Not merely the jar, a trespass." That word got me. Trespass, in Wolfe's world, isn't just a matter of burglary. It means someone dared step into the temple and shift a single sacred stone. And if there's one thing that shakes Nero Wolfe's composure, it's a trespass under his roof. He sat heavily, his lips compressed. "Archie, inventory. That meant a full sweep. Every drawer, file, shelf, and cabinet in the office was mine to open and note. I spent the better part of an hour poking around, which is like rifling through a fortress library designed by a paranoid genius. The result? Nothing missing, nothing added. At least not that my mortal eyes could detect. I reported in. All present and accounted for, including the unpaid bills, unless you count the dust on the globe. You want me to fingerprint the spice rack?" Wolfe glared. "The jar suffices. Someone intruded here and someone moved it. That is enough." The phone rang at 11:47. I picked it up. It was our bakery friend, Miss Emma Brookfield. Her voice was clipped as if she'd been running. "Mr. Goodwin, tell Mr. Wolfe I need to see him. It's urgent." "Urgent, eh? Trouble in pastry paradise?" She didn't laugh. "This isn't a joke. Someone was in my shop last night. They didn't take anything. But the register was open, papers shuffled. I found a knife left on the counter. A bread knife. but it wasn't mine. I covered the receiver and looked at Wolfe. His eyes narrowed. I whispered, "Looks like we're not the only ones with a phantom jar turner." He gave a curt nod. "Tell her to come." By 2 o'clock, Miss Brookfield was seated in Wolfe's red leather chair, back straight, hands clasped. She was a tidy little woman with hair pulled tight, but her eyes were dancing like sparklers. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "I didn't imagine it. Someone came in after hours. The door was locked when I left. When I returned this morning, there were no signs of forced entry. But the register had been opened, receipts moved, and that knife." She shuddered. "They've never seen it before." Wolfe nodded. "Describe the knife." "It was long, serrated, wooden handle. Not new. It looked used." "And you brought it?" She shook her head. "I left it there. I was afraid to touch it." Archie Goodwin, professional errand boy, was promptly dispatched. I got the knife and brought it back in a bakery bag, wrapped like a croissant. It sat on Wolfe's desk, grim and ordinary. He regarded it without touching. "Archie, have Saul Panzer report here at 6 o'clock." I raised my brows. "Saul, you think this is headed somewhere nasty?" Wolfe's voice was grave. "Trespass escalates. First the register, then my office. It is a pattern." Miss Brookfield twisted her fingers. "But why me? Why you? Who would—" She stopped, swallowed. "Who indeed?" Wolfe said softly. He leaned forward, staring at her with that weight of stillness he can produce like no other. "Who benefits from your disquiet, Miss Brookfield? Who profits from unsettling you?" Her lips parted. "My brother," she said at last. "David. He wants me to sell the bakery. He says it isn't worth the hours, the effort. He has friends who want the property." Wolfe leaned back. "Archie, note, Mr. David Brookfield." "Noted," I said. "Anyone else?" Wolfe asked her. She hesitated, then sighed. "There's a rival baker. Mr. Harkins. He lost several customers to me this year. He resents it." "Archie." "Mr. Harkins, on the list," I confirmed. "And the third," Wolfe prompted. She blinked. "Third? Always three?" Wolfe murmured. "If two are evident, a third is concealed. Who is the concealed third?" Emma swallowed hard. I don't know." Wolfe closed his eyes. "You will." I didn't like the way he said it. That night, Saul arrived, punctual as a train schedule. Wolfe laid out the situation with the precision of a general. The saffron jar, the bakery register, the knife, trespass upon trespass. Saul frowned. Somebody's pushing buttons, seeing how far they can get before you push back. "Precisely," Wolfe said, "and they have now pushed far enough." He opened his eyes, hard and cold. "Archie, tomorrow you will begin inquiries. Saul, you will shadow. We will locate our trespasser and bring them to heel." And with that, Wolfe reached for his beer. As if the case were already solved, the trespass already avenged. But me, I had a hunch we hadn't even seen the start of it. The thing about Saul Panzer is that he doesn't just enter a scene, he blends into it until you almost forget he's there, which is probably why Wolfe finally sent for him. When Saul appeared at the brownstone the following morning, he had the same calm neutrality he always wears, like an old coat that's never gone out of style. Wolfe had asked for him, and that meant the business with the bakery bag had ripened beyond Wolfe's threshold for mere curiosity. Wolfe hates moving. He loathes it like spinach, traffic, or, worst of all, meetings that stretch past dinner time. For him to summon Saul meant he was putting a piece on the board he couldn't nudge himself. I'd filled him in on the suspects, Angela with her nervous hands, Carlo with his flour-dusted defensiveness, Mason with his wide smile that never touched his eyes, and Mrs. Keener, who managed to wield widowhood like a knife. Wolfe had said little in return, just a grumble about Carlo's odious misuse of yeast when I mentioned the bread. But now, with Saul sitting stiff in one of the red chairs, Wolfe leaned forward just enough to look like a man conducting an orchestra, only he could hear. "Saul," Wolfe said, "an object was misplaced in this room. That is not acceptable. Someone has tampered with my order, and I will not abide interference with my environment. Mr. Goodwin will give you particulars. You are to observe, unobtrusively, the movements of each of these people and report with celerity. Your fee, as always, will be the customary." That was all. No drama. Just Wolfe planting a flag in the ground, saying the matter had shifted into terrain worth money. When Saul left, I stayed in the office while Wolfe returned to a book. Something about the morphology of orchids that would have put me asleep before the first footnote. I sat with my notebook, thinking. The missing paper hadn't reappeared, which meant it was either ash or in someone's pocket, and the bakery bag hadn't been just a sack of rye. Not if Wolfe was spinning up Saul Panza for reconnaissance. That afternoon I paid another visit to Mason Atwell. He was in his shop on 3rd Avenue, rearranging cakes in the window like they were pawns in a sugar-coated chess game. His hands were too precise, too slow, the way a man moves when he's thinking hard about something else. "Well, if it isn't the detective's shadow," he said, spotting me. "Come for another bun?" "Maybe," I said. "Depends on whether you're serving buns or stories. You told me yesterday that Mrs. Keener dropped in late for bread. You neglected to mention she left without paying." His eyebrows jumped. "Did I? Oversight. She has an account." "Does she?" He folded his arms, still watching the cakes. "What's it matter to you?" "It matters if you're trying to keep Wolfe's attention off your balance sheet." That was enough to flush him. He wheeled around, face pinker than a glazed cherry. "Look, I've got no quarrel with Nero Wolfe, but I won't have my customers harassed. If the widow's purse is light, that's her affair. I bake bread, I don't bake alibis." The thing about Mason is he always talks a shade too much when cornered. He tried to push past me, but I leaned against the counter and kept it casual. "One more thing," I said. "Did you know Carlo's cousin runs a delivery van out of Jersey? Wolfe had his name scribbled on a paper that's now missing. You wouldn't know how that paper walked away, would you?" He swallowed. "If I did, I wouldn't tell you." That was all I needed. His refusal was too quick, too rehearsed. He knew about the paper. Whether he'd seen it, stolen it, or just heard whispers, he was connected. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the rundown. He listened, motionless, his lips pressed tight. "Pooey," he said at last. "Mr. Atwell is a trifle. His wares are as insipid as his intellect. Yet he reveals what others conceal, and that makes him useful." Wolfe reached for the bell cord and rang. Fritz entered, immaculate as ever, and Wolfe instructed him to prepare squab with tarragon for dinner. Business over. For him. But the case wasn't on ice. That evening, just after 9, I got a phone call from Saul. His voice was low, but steady. "Archie, I was tailing Angela Vickers. She's careful, but not enough. She met with Carlo at a diner on 72nd. No bread between them. They talked about money. She looked scared. He looked angry." I whistled. "Did you catch the words?" "Not much. Something about the formula and not letting Wolfe have it. That's your nugget." I thanked him and hung up, then relayed it to Wolfe. "The formula," Wolfe repeated, tasting the word like a rare spice. "Archie, have you ever observed the ferocity with which humans guard their recipes? They are cultural scripture. If what has been purloined concerns such a recipe, then its theft is both venal and predictable. We must now determine whose scripture it is." At that moment, the doorbell rang. I went to answer it and found Mrs. Keener standing in the vestibule, her coat buttoned up to her chin despite the mild air. She clutched a paper bag. "I must see Mr. Wolfe," she said breathlessly. "At once." Inside, she perched on the edge of a chair, the bag in her lap. Wolfe raised a brow, not moving. "Madame, you disturb me at an inopportune hour. Proceed." She opened the bag. Inside was a loaf of bread, dark-crusted, aromatic even through its wrapping. "This," she said, voice quavering, "is what it's about. They'll kill each other for it." Wolfe didn't reach for the bread. He merely stared at it as if it were a rare orchid about to bloom. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "My husband's formula," she whispered. "His rye. Everyone wants it. Mason, Carlo, Angela, they all think it's theirs. But it's mine. Mine to protect." The pressure in the room thickened. The missing slip of paper, the furtive meetings, the bag left behind. It was all tied to this bread. Wolfe closed his eyes, folded his hands, and exhaled. "Archie," he said softly, "secure the doors. We are entering the final movement." And for the first time since this started, I realized someone might be willing to do worse than rearrange a spice jar or lift a note. Bread is life, and life makes people dangerous. If Wolfe had been a river, he'd have been the kind that looks slow and harmless on the surface, but underneath, whole logs and boats vanish without a splash. That was the stage we were entering now. No explosions, no running gun battles, no blood-stained confessions. Just Wolfe leaning back in his chair and letting the current swirl the way he wanted. After Horst's incident with the tampered files, Wolfe shut himself in his room for nearly an hour. Fritz and I had learned long ago not to treat that as an intermission. It was more like the orchestra holding its breath while the conductor raised his baton. When Wolfe came back down to the office, he didn't say anything at first. He just sat, hands folded over his belly, eyes half closed as though the orchids upstairs were still drifting in his head. I gave him 5 minutes before I decided to take the role of useful irritant. "Well, boss," I said, "our guests are turning your office into a revolving door. We've got a tampered file in Horst's hands, a bakery bag doing cartwheels between clients, and a lawyer so nervous he jumps when Fritz drops a fork. Any chance you might feel like giving the troops some direction?" He opened one eye and looked at me the way a lion might regard a chipmunk that had wandered too close. "Fie! Your appetite for chatter is insatiable. Direction, Archie, comes when facts can be arranged in order. At present, they resemble the ingredients of a meal before Fritz exerts his skill." "Except," I said, "someone's rearranging the pantry before the chef can get to it." That at least got the second eye open. Wolfe sighed. "You may inform Saul Panzer that I wish his services tonight. He is to inquire discreetly into the movements of Miss Rachel Ellery and Mrs. Juno Drake during the hours in which the bakery bag might have passed from hand to hand. He is to note, in particular, if either woman had occasion to misplace or conceal a package." "Fine. Saul can map their footsteps. Meanwhile, Horst is still looking like he swallowed glass. He's convinced the world is out to replace his files with dummy duplicates. Want me to keep him under wraps? Let him pace. It wastes his nervous energy indoors where I may observe him." Wolfe tilted his head, eyelids drooping again. The tampering, Archie, was not for the files themselves. It was to probe, to see whether he would notice. A fishing expedition. That was typical. Wolfe. Seeing a fishing line when I only saw ripples. I got Saul on the phone and passed along the assignment. He didn't need more than 3 sentences to know what to do. Saul had a way of moving through the city like fog. Quiet, thorough, impossible to pin down. By the time I hung up, Wolfe had ordered me to summon Rachel Ellery for a private word. I figured she'd balk, but she showed up that evening wearing a blue silk blouse and an expression carved out of nerves. "Miss Ellery," Wolfe said without rising, "you misjudged your timing earlier. It is fortunate for you that I am a patient man." Her fingers tightened on the strap of her handbag. "I don't understand." "You arrived here this afternoon under the guise of solicitude for Horst Meeker," Wolfe continued. "In fact, you intended to reclaim an object, most likely the bakery bag or its contents, before it could be examined. You were thwarted by circumstance. Her chin went up. That's absurd. Why would I come here, of all places, to steal something? Wolfe breathed through his nose. I said nothing about theft. Reclamation is a different matter. Horst Meeker trusted you once, did he not? Enough to confide about his troubles with Juno Drake? Rachel swallowed but held her ground. We were colleagues. We talked. Wolfe flicked his hand. Archie will escort you out. I've heard what I require. That was it. No grilling, no shouting. Just a statement and a dismissal. Rachel left stiff-backed, and I escorted her to the curb. On the way, I tried casual. Seems to me you've got more invested in this than a passing interest. Care to enlighten me? She shook her head. You people see conspiracies everywhere. Then she hailed a cab and vanished. Back upstairs, Wolfe was sipping beer, eyes closed again. Her denial was too polished, too prompt. She had rehearsed it. Okay, I said. But what's she covering for? Horst's files? The bakery bag? Or some sideline we haven't sniffed yet? That, said Wolfe, is why Saul earns his fee. He will uncover the pattern of her movements. When combined with Mrs. Drake's, the fabric will reveal itself. Around 9, Saul called with his first report. Juno Drake had spent part of the afternoon visiting a midtown confectioner, where she purchased a small assortment of chocolate truffles. Rachel Ellery, meanwhile, had stopped at a stationery shop and bought a packet of heavy envelopes. Neither errand sounded like dynamite, but Wolfe listened with a satisfied grunt. Trifles, Archie, he murmured. Always trifles. The following morning, the sanctity of the brownstone was disturbed again. This time it was Saul himself, arriving with a thin grin and a thicker report. He handed Wolfe a folded sheet covered in his neat handwriting. Mrs. Drake, he said, met a man late last night. Tall, brown overcoat, hat pulled low. Exchange was brief. Something passed between them. Couldn't see what, but her bag looked lighter afterward. Rachel Ellery spent the same hour burning papers in her apartment fireplace. The janitor confirmed. Wolfe read, then laid the paper down with care. Excellent. You may send your bill, Mr. Panzer. After Saul departed, I asked, so where does that leave us? One suspect disposing of papers, another handing off goodies in the dark. Which horse are you betting on? Neither, said Wolfe. Not yet. But the circle tightens. They have shown their hands, not the cards, but the fact of holding them. He turned his gaze on me. You will arrange for all concerned parties to attend here tomorrow evening at 8. That includes Mr. Meeker, Miss Ellery, Mrs. Drake, and Councillor Fenn. They will resist. You will persist. I raised my eyebrows. So we're going for the big round table showdown already. Not yet. A prelude, a gathering to observe how they sit, how they breathe, how they look at one another. The truth will announce itself if the stage is set. And just like that, the baton came down. Wolfe had begun his overture. The thing about Nero Wolfe's office is that it has seen more sweat without anyone lifting a finger than most boxing gyms. People come in there believing they're in control, that they can handle a fat man in a chair and a wisecracking secretary with a notebook. Then Wolfe talks, and they realize it's not a parlor. It's a trap. That night, Wolfe had me summon every last one of the dramatis personae into the brownstone sanctum. I made the calls briskly, leaning on the urgency. Wolfe requires your presence, I said, not asks. You'd be surprised how many people will show up in a hurry if you make it sound like not showing up would brand them permanently guilty. By 7:30, the chairs were filled, the air was thick, and the tension was climbing like ivy on a trellis. Wolfe sat in his throne, massive and unmoved, one finger resting lightly on his armrest as though the whole business bored him. It didn't, of course. I could tell by the gleam in his eyes that his mind was buzzing like a well-fed hive. The cast was complete. Harold Mercer, upright but twitchy, still clinging to his notion of being the aggrieved partner. Marion Loring, her eyes sharp as glass shards, carrying her fear like a weapon. Victor Kessler, twitching his knee in rhythm with his pulse, still convinced everyone underestimated him. Dr. Selby, quiet, guarded, arms folded in front of him like a barricade. And Lucy Caldwell, who sat in a prim little knot, trying to look small but failing to hide the flicker of pride behind her lips. Wolfe looked them over as if they were jars in his kitchen cabinet. "Mr. Goodwin has supplied me with facts," he began, his tone calm, deep and as thick as cream. "Some of you have supplied me with falsehoods. I dislike both extremes, truth untempered by relevance and lies untempered by skill. But we shall sift." You could feel the whole room shift a half-inch forward. I leaned against the wall, notebook in hand, because the only thing better than Wolfe's opening move is watching people squirm while he makes it. "Let us begin with this." He raised his finger and aimed it at the paper bag resting on the corner of his desk, the one I had retrieved from the brownstone kitchen earlier. A common item, a bag from Rizzoli's bakery. Harmless in appearance. Yet this humble vessel traversed 3 sets of hands before it was abandoned in my hall. Its presence here is the fulcrum upon which your fabrications collapse. Victor Kessler snorted. "You're making a mountain out of a muffin bag." Wolfe's eyes flicked to him, slow and heavy. "Your glibness betrays you, sir." The bag was not empty. It contained 2 items, a cinnamon twist, half consumed, and a folded sheet of paper. The twist is irrelevant except to suggest who might have been careless with crumbs. The paper, however, contained notes on Mercer and Kessler's financial ledgers. Notes that did not belong to Mr. Mercer, nor by his style, to you. Mercer stiffened, but Wolfe kept going, his voice like a glacier grinding forward. "They belonged, unmistakably, to Dr. Selby. The notations matched samples from your hand. You visited the bakery, you folded your observations into a bag, and, whether by accident or by design, left it here. Thus our circle tightens." All eyes swung to Selby. He lifted his chin, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. "I did analyze the ledgers," he admitted, "but I never left anything in your house. I don't even know how it got here." "Fee," Wolfe said. "The bag was not transported by spirits. It arrived by hand. The question is, whose hand and why?" Marion Loring spoke up suddenly, her voice tight. If Selby was snooping in the ledgers, then maybe he had reason to sabotage them or cover his tracks. Wolfe didn't even blink. "A convenient suggestion, madam. But Mr. Goodwin's inquiry revealed that you too frequented Rizzoli's bakery, though your appetite was for eclairs, not cinnamon twists. You were observed last Thursday." Marion's mouth dropped, then clamped shut. Score 1 for Wolfe's omniscience. He steepled his fingers. "Mr. Mercer, your claim was that your partner had hidden funds. You were correct, though the concealment was more artless than ingenious. The discrepancies were flagged not by you, but by Miss Caldwell, your bookkeeper. She, in her attempt to shield herself from dismissal or blame, confided them to Dr. Selby, hoping for his discretion. He lacked the subtlety to remain uninvolved, and he analyzed them. Yet Miss Caldwell, fretful of consequences, copied his notes, on bakery stationery no less, and sought to present them to you, Mr. Mercer. Somewhere in this chain, the bag was diverted here." Lucy Caldwell flushed crimson. Her lips parted, then shut again. Wolfe had cracked her like an egg. Now, Wolfe rumbled, the crucial question: who manipulated this clumsy ballet of concealment and revelation? Who engineered the appearance of guilt, and for what? The silence was so deep you could hear the radiator tick. Wolfe let it hang, savoring it. Then he turned his gaze directly on Kessler. "You, sir, you orchestrated the suspicion upon your partner, hoping to gain leverage in your financial disputes. By nudging Miss Caldwell, by intercepting Selby's work, by planting the bag in my vestibule, you sought to create an appearance of conspiracy. But the clumsiness was your own undoing. You misjudged Miss Caldwell's anxiety, and you failed to anticipate that my home is not an alley into which one may toss refuse unobserved. Kessler's face turned scarlet. That's preposterous. I never set foot in your place until you invited me here. How could I have— Wolfe raised a hand, silencing him. Archie. That was my cue. I straightened, flipping my notebook. Funny thing, Victor. Remember Monday when you said you'd never been near the West Side except for Mercer's office? That was cute. Because Saul Panzer happened to spot you slipping out of Rizzoli's bakery at 4:30, the very afternoon that bag went missing from Selby's hand. He tailed you. You didn't go to Mercer's or your own apartment. You came this way and lingered across from our stoop. Saul doesn't tail for free, but he doesn't lie either. So unless there's another Victor Kessler with a limp in his right leg buying biscotti, you've got explaining to do. Kessler's jaw dropped. His leg twitched under his chair. The room buzzed with low exclamations. Mercer leaned forward, his voice raw. Victor, you damn it! You tried to frame me. Kessler tried to recover ground. You don't understand. Mercer was bleeding the business dry. You had to manufacture guilt, Wolfe thundered, his voice rising for the first time that evening. Your motives are transparent. You wished to corner him, to force a sale of his shares on terms favorable to you. Instead, you exposed your own treachery. And worse, you presumed to employ my household as your stage. That last line was the death blow. Nobody trespasses on Wolfe's brownstone. Not with schemes, not with bakery bags, not with anything. Kessler's face collapsed in on itself, the fight draining from him. He sagged back, muttering something about being desperate. Wolfe exhaled, leaned back, and let the silence gather weight again. Then, in a voice almost gentle, "You will make restitution, Mr. Kessler, to your partner, both financial and reputational, or the police will receive a full accounting from me. Choose wisely." The man nodded, broken. Mercer looked like he wanted to both strangle and thank Wolfe, but thought better of doing either. Wolfe flicked his fingers. That concludes our business. Mr. Goodwin, show them out. One by one they filed out, chastened, muttering, shaken. The last was Marion, who gave me a look half grateful, half suspicious. Lucy Caldwell slipped past with her head down, and Victor Kessler limped out like a man walking to his own funeral. When the door finally shut and the echoes faded, I turned back to Wolfe. He was settling deeper into his chair, eyes closed, fingers steepled. "You know," I said, "there are easier ways to get free pastries than wrecking a partnership." His lips curved the faintest inch. "Archie, if mankind could resist folly, I should starve." I grinned. Case closed. I've seen Nero Wolfe play conductor before, waving his hand just once and setting a whole orchestra of human confusion into obedient tune. But that Thursday evening in the office was one for the books. The brownstone had that heavy silence it always gets before the last act of one of our dramas. The only sounds were the clock ticking on the wall and the faint buzz of the Orchid's fans upstairs, filtering faintly through the walls like some secret percussion. Wolfe had gathered the whole cast, and when he gathers, he doesn't do it for entertainment. The suspects were in their assigned seats, though none of them realized that Wolfe had assigned them by choice rather than accident. Mrs. Celia Hart, compact as a sparrow but with eyes sharp as hatpins, sat to the far left of Wolfe's desk. Beside her, Lance Porter leaned back with the casual disdain of a man who thinks being good-looking will get him out of anything, including cross-examination. On the other side, Marion Cutter, wearing her black and white baker's uniform, perched like she was ready to sprint if necessary. Finally, Andrew Harrow, the writer who'd brought in that ridiculous bag, sat hunched, wringing his hands as if he were testing them for leaks. Wolfe himself was, as ever, lodged in the great chair behind his desk, motionless except for the occasional flecks of fingers on the armrest. He hadn't spoken more than 2 sentences since everyone entered, and that silence had stretched into something like a spell. He let it thicken until even I, who should have been immune by now, began to feel like I had something to confess. Then he finally broke it. "You are all here," he said, "because the matter has ripened, and because—" He paused, lifting his head an inch. "I dislike waste. It is wasteful for intelligent men and women to destroy one another over trifles, though I must admit, trifles often serve admirably to expose the destructive elements in human character." Mrs. Hart shifted her handbag from one knee to another, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, not turning his head. "The bag." I went to the side table where it had been sitting since Harrow first delivered it, picked it up, and set it in the center of Wolfe's desk blotter. An ordinary bakery bag, creased, smudged, carrying faint whiffs of sugar and flour. Ordinary until Wolfe laid 2 fingers on it like it was a chalice. "This bag," he said, "is the fulcrum. Mr. Harrow, when you brought it here, you pretended it was a harmless trifle. You were, in truth, terrified. Not merely nervous. Terrified. I would like now to relieve you of your burden." Harrow's lips parted, but Wolfe's eyes cut him off. "First, the facts. Within the last 2 weeks, each of you in this room has sought possession of a set of papers. Papers containing recipes, yes, but also contracts, letters, and commitments of a financial nature. These were in the possession of Mrs. Hart, whose bakery, though seemingly modest, has been leveraged into something far larger." Mrs. Hart gave a little gasp, like someone had pinched her. "Those papers," Wolfe went on, "vanished. Then they reappeared. Mr. Harrow found them concealed in this bag, left in his study without explanation. He had no part in the theft, but he feared what involvement might mean for his reputation. So he brought it to me." All eyes turned to Harrow, who swallowed, nodded, and then muttered, I didn't know what else to do." "Just so," Wolfe said. "Now, who placed them there? Who risked detection, not merely for recipes, but for leverage? Contracts worth thousands, and more importantly, why use Mr. Harrow as an unwitting custodian?" I leaned against the wall, arms folded. This was Wolfe tightening the net. He had already picked his fish. He was just waiting for it to thrash. "Consider," Wolfe said, folding his hands. "Mr. Porter, you had the motive. You're in financial distress. You believed the bakery's expansion could be turned to your advantage, or to ransom, and you possessed the arrogance to assume you could charm away suspicion, but your methods are too blunt. Theft by direct intrusion, perhaps, but not this." Porter smirked, though it came out thin. "You make me sound like a safecracker." "You are worse," Wolfe said coldly. "You are careless." Then Wolfe turned to Marion Cutter. "You, Miss Cutter, had equal motive. You resented Mrs. Hart. You wanted to prove you could outdo her, that her recipes were not unique but stolen, that you were the true artisan. Yet you lack the calculation for so indirect a maneuver. You would have brandished the documents, not hidden them." Marion's face flushed a dangerous pink. She opened her mouth, then clamped it shut. "And Mrs. Hart herself?" "Ah." Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. "The most intriguing possibility. One might think you staged a theft to shield yourself, to draw suspicion outward. Yet you are far too cautious to risk so elaborate a deception. You guard your reputation with ferocity." Mrs. Hart sputtered. "I would never—" "Indeed," Wolfe cut her off. "You would not." Silence again. Wolfe let it stretch, like the taut string of a bow. Then his eyes swiveled, slowly, heavily, to Harrow. "And so, Mr. Harrow, we return to you." Harrow jerked, as if struck. "Me? But I didn't—" "You didn't place the bag in your own study, no. But you did invite someone in. Someone you trusted. You told me, sir, that you had no callers that day. You lied. There was one. Miss Cutter, is it not true you visited Mr. Harrow on the very afternoon he later found the bag? Marian's head snapped toward him. Andrew, he stammered. Well, it wasn't. She only came by briefly. Precisely, Wolfe said. Briefly. To drop something off. Miss Cutter, you were indeed there, but not as thief. You were the delivery agent. The true instigator required a plausible handoff. And who might that be? He didn't wait for them to answer. It was Mrs. Hart. You, madam, employed Miss Cutter without her knowledge, manipulating her into conveying the incriminating bag. You had hidden the papers, intending later to discover their absence, shift blame and consolidate sympathy. But when Mr. Harrow panicked and brought them to me, your design unraveled. The silence this time was volcanic. Mrs. Hart's lips thinned to nothing. Porter's grin widened like a spectator at a brawl. Marian looked stunned, and Harrow, well, he looked like a man watching his own roof cave in. Finally, Mrs. Hart spoke, very low. You can't prove that. Wolfe's brows lifted. Proof? The proof lies in detail. When Mr. Goodwin inspected your bakery, he noted that a certain spice jar had been tampered with. Cinnamon. That jar bore traces of glue on its rim. Why? Because you had concealed within it a note directing Miss Cutter to deliver the bag to Mr. Harrow. Mr. Goodwin did not read the note, but he observed enough to realize the jar was not as it should be. Moreover, your fingerprints are on the inside of this bag, though Mr. Harrow insists he never saw you place it. A contradiction only explicable if you prepared it yourself. I hadn't realized Wolfe had noticed that. Leave it to him to file away something I only half registered. Mrs. Hart's hands clenched on her handbag, but she said nothing. You sought to cripple rivals and preserve your secrets, Wolfe finished, his tone soft, almost weary. But in your zeal, you turned a petty rivalry into a sordid spectacle. You exploited Mr. Harrow's fear, Miss Cutter's ambition, Mr. Porter's greed. An orchestration of folly conducted by you, and now exposed. He leaned back, eyes closing. The case, for him, was already finished. Mrs. Hart rose suddenly, her chair scraping. I won't sit here and be insulted. Sit, Wolfe commanded, without opening his eyes. And she did. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Wolfe said, Archie, telephone Inspector Kramer. He will be irritated. But he will come. Mrs. Hart will make her statements there, where they belong. That was that. The orchestra had played its final note, and Wolfe, as always, had been the only conductor. The thing about Wolfe is that once he's laid it all out, the room gets lighter. It's like someone cracked open a window that had been sealed shut for years. The tension leaks out, even if it leaves behind the smell of whatever's been festering inside. That night, after Wolfe revealed that the sabotage had been orchestrated not by chefs or competitors, but by a supposedly loyal accountant, a fellow named Morton Belling, whose mild expression fooled half the room, the brownstone was back in its familiar state of hush. Of course, getting to that point wasn't exactly smooth. Morton didn't go down easy. He turned pink at the ears and tried to argue figures, contracts, and inconsistencies in Wolfe's reasoning, which was like trying to box with a foghorn. Wolfe didn't even raise his voice. He merely leaned back, shut his eyes, and said, Archie, summarize. Which is Wolfe speak for. Remind them all that I never miss a stitch. So I did. I pointed out the bakery bag Morton had accidentally left behind in the brownstone, how it contained more than eclairs. Namely, the draft contract he had been quietly editing, slipping in clauses to siphon off profits when the new bakery partnership was finalized. I reminded him of his shaky alibi the night the safe was tampered with at Carlotta's bakery, and how Saul had trailed him to a late-night meeting with a distributor he claimed never to have met. And then I repeated Wolfe's line, polished, sharp, and immovable. Mr. Belling, you tried to knead your theft into the dough of enterprise, but bread rises when yeast is warm, and lies collapse when logic is cold. That shut him up, though I had the suspicion he was already figuring out how many years a lawyer might shave off his sentence. Carlotta, the client, sat with her hands tight in her lap, pale but steady. She wasn't triumphant. She looked tired. Betrayal from someone close always leaves that flavor in the mouth. It's not sweet. It's not bitter. It's just heavy. Once the police had done their part, the suspects gone and Morton escorted out with his protests dissolving into the city night, I closed the door and leaned against it. The brownstone sighed with relief, if a building can sigh. Wolfe, on the other hand, wanted his beer, and he wanted it now. I fetched it because that's my job description. Major domo, errand boy, legman, and sometime babysitter to a 7/8 of a ton genius. He tipped the glass back, draining it slow, while Fritz peeked from the dining room like a cat checking whether the thunderstorm had passed. "Fritz," Wolfe finally said, setting the empty glass down. "A proper dinner. Duck, if we have it." "We have it," Fritz said, the relief in his voice a whole paragraph. I let Wolfe have his silence until the duck was halfway carved. Only then did I ease into a chair, plant my elbows on the table, and say, "I'll give it to you straight, boss. You surprised me. I was betting Carlotta's rival, Marjorie, would be the one, with sugar under her nails. But Morton, the guy could barely butter toast without apologizing. Pa." Wolfe flicked his fingers, carving off his share. The obvious suspect is rarely the true culprit. The outwardly aggressive seldom has the leisure for patient subterfuge. Mr. Belling's quietude was his shield. He relied on others to dismiss him. "Worked for a while," I admitted, until he brought his shopping bag to our doorstep. "That," Wolfe said, pausing to appreciate the duck skin, "was his folly. The universe rarely arranges itself so conveniently. He believed in accidents. I do not." I let him chew on that, literally and philosophically. Then I leaned back. "So tell me, Wolfe. You said yes to this case faster than usual. Was it the eclairs? Or were you just itching for an accountant to chew on?" His eyes, half closed as usual, opened a fraction wider. "Neither. Miss Carlotta possessed qualities rare in clients: restraint, integrity, and dignity. Her request was not only for herself, but for the preservation of her father's legacy. I dislike sentimental indulgence, yet I dislike more the corruption of honest industry by parasitic deceit." That was Wolfe's way of saying Carlotta earned his respect, and that's rarer than a steak cooked the way he wants on the first try. Dinner proceeded. Fritz brought out a pear tart, and Wolfe consumed it with such satisfaction you'd think solving mysteries was only his side gig. When the plates were cleared and Wolfe returned to his chair in the office, the brownstone returned to its natural rhythm, the kind where the air is heavy with silence and the orchids upstairs get more attention than the world outside. I took my usual perch with a notebook, making sure the paperwork was lined up for Inspector Kramer's inevitable visit in the morning. Wolfe leaned back, hands on his stomach, as immovable as Mount Rushmore. "You know," I said, half to myself, "that bakery bag didn't look like much when it first showed up. Just paper and sugar dust. Funny how something so ordinary can end up being the string that unravels the whole sweater." Wolfe snorted. "You speak as though this were remarkable. The ordinary conceals more villainy than the extraordinary. Men trust what is familiar, and in that trust lies their peril. A bakery bag, a ledger, a word in passing, they are the very instruments of revelation." That was his philosophy for the night, and it was a good one. Me, I'm a little more practical. I like things you can hang your hat on. Still, there's a truth there. Wolfe sees the world not in the fireworks, but in the sparks no one else bothers to notice. I clicked the lamp off, leaving just the soft glow from his chair. Well, boss, I'll say this. If every case ended with duck and pear tart, I'd be a happy man. But somehow I doubt Morton Belling's going to be sending us any baked goods from prison. Wolfe's lips curved, just slightly. If he does, Archie, decline them. Stale bread is unpalatable. Staler morals, intolerable. That was the end of it. The brownstone shut its doors on the world, and for the moment, order was restored. Wolfe had his dinner, his philosophy, and his orchids waiting upstairs. I had my notes, my paycheck, and the smug satisfaction of watching another swindler fall flat. Cases come and go, but the brownstone, quiet, steady, stubborn, remains. And Wolfe, like the duck he'd just demolished, is never anything but himself, immovable, insatiable, and occasionally right on the money.